Anyway, I've got a super busy agenda. Between me and Mike, we're going to take the next about 3 hours to talk about Silverlight 2 features, and it really is a full agenda. So I'm going to get started right away. No pre-jokes or anything like that, which I typically spend a lot of time doing, like right now. So what we've got today is a 2-part session. Part 1 is going to be me, and I'm going to talk about overview feature set, and I'm going to spend some time talking about building an application, and I'm going to do sort of the core stuff to build that app, which is simple networking, simple XML, and introduction to the, let's see, controls and data binding. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and he's going to make the app, that's part 2. He's going to make the app shine a little bit, and he's going to show some of the new features in Silverlight, some of the new, what I'll say, exciting features, such as, I think, deep zoom. Mike, you doing that?
Oh yeah, we're going deep.
Yeah, all right. It's good to hear. He had to throw that in after Scott's keynote. He's still trying to figure it out, but I think it'll be a cool demo anyway. I've just wasted 5 minutes of my hour and 45, or whatever it is, 15, but I'm going to take all that time. I'll save about 5 minutes for Q&A after my session. I'll stick around between the sessions, and then after Mike's talk, we'll both do Q&A after that. But I'll save just a little bit of time to let you know I will be going long. A lot of the stuff I'll be showing will be samples in Visual Studio, just to show you really how a developer would go about building these sorts of a thing, or Silverlight apps. Now, the stuff on the left up in this list, the top, let's see, 3.5 lines, that's Silverlight 1.0, which is really about graphics, video, animations, those sorts of things. Silverlight 2 is everything else. So you can see in the last year, the team has been extremely busy adding new features to the product. Everything you see on here ships in the core Silverlight download, the approximate 4 megabyte one-time download. The things that are in, if you can see them, the things that are off-white up there are things that Mike and I won't specifically cover today. Everything else on here we'll cover in some way, shape, or form in our talk today, at least a brief overview of it. The only thing up there that's that I do want to call out, because it may not be obvious, is the crypto APIs or cryptography APIs. What that is that we have some APIs that allow you to do AES encryption. Kind of if you have some data that you want to password protect, you can use these APIs to sort of password protect it and either save it locally, which Mike will talk about saving locally, or you can send it back to the server. Otherwise, everything in here we'll kind of cover in some way, shape, or form. There are really 2 parts of Silverlight. You can think of the core runtime, and then you can think of, we have additional libraries that ship as part of a software development kit or an SDK. And the things that are in the additional libraries, if you were to use these in your app, they're packaged as part of your application. So these libraries are actually packaged up in your app. And those are things like the dynamic languages are shipped as part of the SDK, so they'd be packaged as part of your app if you leverage those. We have additional controls, and I'll give you a breakdown of controls in a few slides. And then some XML libraries, such as Link for XML, which I'll be showing, and then some other XML serialization libraries, as well as some Atom and RSS libraries that ship in the SDK. Scott, I don't think he talked this morning about the release of Silverlight, except for to say that we do have the Beta 1 version available today for everybody to use, and all my demos today are built on top of that Beta 1 version. So I don't have anything special cooked up here that's a special private build. Everything I'm doing is built on that. We have another beta scheduled, which will be Q2 of this year. In terms of tools, I think Scott covered this fairly well. The one thing I did want to mention was that for every public release of Silverlight we will have a public release of the tools to support that, and that includes the Expression Suite and the Visual Studio Suite. One final note on the tools is that I will be showing all my demos today in Visual Studio. Mike will be doing, I think, at least one demo in Blend. But I'll be showing a designer view in Visual Studio. It's not an interactive designer view, meaning you can't click on things and move things around. That is coming. Today it's just a preview view, but later on this year you will get the interactive designer view in Visual Studio. And with that, I want to get kicked off. I'm going to spend a lot of time today, and I think Mike's the same way. We're going to spend a lot of time actually doing demos. And Scott talked about, I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio. Scott talked a little bit about controls, and he talked about media. And so I want to show a little bit of both, but I want to show something slightly different. The first thing that I want to talk about is sort of what I've got set up here in Visual Studio. This is, for the most part, just a plain Visual Studio Silverlight project. I've done a few things to prime it just to make the demo go a little quicker, and I'll explain them as I go. But the only thing I really want to explain here is that in the project, there's really 2 parts. There is a Silverlight part, which is the bottom part here, and really that's the Silverlight app. And if you will, the Silverlight app is a collection of pages, such as page.xaml, which is the main thing I'll be dealing with. And there's an application file as well. That's what this app.xaml is. A page is, it has markup, which is XAML markup, which is what you see in the view down below. But a page has that, and then it has some code behind, which is the programming logic associated with the page or the markup. In addition, in your Silverlight app, you can have loose resources, you can have library files. What Visual Studio does, it packages up everything in your Silverlight app, and it creates what's called a zap out of it, or an XAP, which is really a zip to archive. What it also does in Visual Studio is that's the mix part of my project, the MIX08 that you see down below here. That's the Silverlight part. What Visual Studio do is we'll compile up my whole app, compile up all the source files, take the XAML, package it up into a zap. It creates a separate web deployment project for me to test it out. That's the thing at the top. Think of this as where I'd actually deploy it. This is actually the built zap, so if I were to actually delete this, and rebuild this project, you'll see it reappears because it built up everything down here, packaged it into this one application, which is really a zip archive, and copied it to my web server. I have a couple video files that I copied out to my web server to make things go a little quicker, but that's really all I've got in my solution file. That's the main ways that I primed this. I added a business object as well. Whoa, Forrest signed in. Great. Sorry. 101, turn off your phone, turn off your IM, turn off blah, blah, blah. I failed that, sorry. Forrest, glad to know you're here if you're out in the audience. So I did add one business object that I'll explain in the course of the demo. But with that, let's go ahead and start doing something here. So the first thing I want to do is I have this plain default Silverlight project, and I'm going to start adding markup. And the reason I'm going to do everything in markup today is I want to do it in Visual Studio because I really want everybody to see kind of what's behind the scenes. Normally when we have the designer or you're using Blend, you'll do all these things in Blend or Visual Studio and it'll generate the markup for you. But really the beauty of Silverlight is it's just so easy and it's got such a simple model. So I really wanted you to kind of see how that model works because it's just very simple and very basic and very powerful. So what I want to start with is one new feature that we added, which is something in general that is layout. So if you use Silverlight 1.0, we didn't have what I'll call as a concept of layout. We didn't have like a grid or a stack panel. In Silverlight 2, we do have the concept of layout. So you can use things like a stack panel to arrange things either horizontally or vertically in a stack, if you will. And I'm going to add another new feature in Silverlight 2.0, which is a text box. And you'll see me dragging a lot of stuff over just because I don't want to have a typo and spend your time while I'm debugging it. All I did is add a text box. I named it. This is how you name things in Silverlight if you're using markup. I gave it a big font so you could see it, a height and width, and I said accepts return equal to true, which just says that it's a multi-line text box. So that is new. Surprisingly, we didn't have text box in Silverlight 1. We do have it in Silverlight 2. And I'm going to go ahead and add a button. So I've added a couple controls, a couple things we just plain didn't have in Silverlight 1, but now we've added them in Silverlight 2. And as you can see, they're stacked right on top of each other. And let's just play a little bit with layout. I really don't want that view. So orientation equals horizontal. Now they're stacked next to each other. And horizontal alignment equals center. And now they're centered within the page. So in Silverlight, it doesn't look like much, but in Silverlight 1.0, you just had to write all that code by hand, which is the great thing about having layout. I can also set a margin, for example, on my button. And so I can set distances between things. Margin equals 4. And you can see they split apart a little bit, but let's give it 10. Split apart a little wider. So we've got a lot of the just plain UI framework features built into Silverlight that you would expect in any platform. So let's do something with this app. So I'm going to add click. And that's an event handler on button. And you can see Visual Studio really good about saying, hey, do you want to create an event handler? I'm going to hit tab. It says, yeah, sure, I'll create an event handler for you. And not only that, I can right click and I can navigate to the event handler. This now takes me to my code behind page. And I've added just a little bit of code in here to prime it. And I'll explain what this link helper is when I get to that in the demo. But for now, let's go ahead and make this do something. And yes, I'm going to do the TB was the name of the text box. I'm going to do a hello world demo. Sorry, but that's what I'm going to do. Show some IntelliSense. I hit env environment.newline. And let's go look at the text box dot text. You can see I get full IntelliSense there. So get all the great advantages of using the .NET framework, which is a new addition to Silverlight 2.0, including the debugging support, the IntelliSense support, which makes it really easy from a developer perspective to be productive. So let's go ahead and run this what you may think of as a boring app. And I'm not going to disagree with you at this point in time, big text. So what I do want to point out is just some standard features that you expect to have. So I can type hello in here. I'm going to hit tab. Takes me over to the text box. So we support accessibility, or it's basically an accessible app. I'll hit space. You can see I hit space on there, and it just behaves the way that you would expect to. In terms of the feature set of the text box, I can cut, copy, paste, all the standard stuff you would expect, just to kind of show you this real full-featured platform. Let's go ahead and add hello world, and I can backspace, that sort of thing. But let's just show you one other feature. I can do hello Japan, or maybe I'd want to use, I don't know, an IME on here if people speak Japanese. Just to show you, not only do we have a text box, this is why we didn't have one in 1.0, it's because they're actually hard to get all the features you really need in the platform working correctly. And that's what we have in Silverlight 2.0, is we do have a full-featured text box, fully accessible controls built into the platform. So, and I think a lot of people just expect that, so let's maybe go on to something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So I'm going to jump back to the Visual Studio. And one of the nice things about Silverlight 1.0 is that it really did a great job with media and animations. So since I can do controls, should be able to go ahead and do media. So let's go ahead and add a media element to this. And this media element is going to play that dolphins.wmv that I had previously added to my project. And let's go ahead and do a little bit more than that. Let's take this text box here and text box dot, let's set its background to, might as well set it to, let's kind of marry the two together. We'll take the old school and the new school, video brush, give it the source name, ME, which is the media element I just added. The name down here is ME. And let's say stretch equals uniform to fill, which is fill the background of that text block completely with media. So I'm going to paint the background of the text block with media. The other thing I want to do is show you our button control here. Someone may have noticed when I added this, it says content. Why doesn't it just say text? The reason it doesn't just say text is because really you don't want just necessarily just text in your button. Maybe you want an image, or maybe you want, since in my case I want to show some old and some new, maybe you want a media element in there. So maybe you want a video button. I don't know, but maybe you do. So let's go ahead and run this and now show you that if you wanted to create the type of experience where you could have two video things playing at once, and I'll fix that in a minute, but and here comes a fish swimming by, or excuse me, a mammal swimming by. So you can see, and now all of a sudden we're getting to a unique experience that steps outside the bounds, maybe a little bit of what you're used to doing with controls, but I think we can do actually a little bit more. I noticed there are a couple problems in there. One is that, I don't know about you, but we had two audio tracks playing at once. So I'm going to turn one off. I'm going to set the is muted property here. The other thing is that, I showed you how you could use video, but we were really, we support video and animations as well. So why don't we go ahead and add a little bit more code. And what I did is I did two things here. I added a rotation to that text box, but I defaulted to 0. But again, it just plays nicely as a first-class citizen in our animation system. And so I can rotate it, which you can see above. I can actually rotate that text box. But why just rotate it if I can add a animation, which I did here at the storyboard. And what I'm doing on my storyboard is I'm saying, hey, start when this page is loaded, all declarative. And I just said, hey, rotate that. Why you'd want to rotate a text box with the media element in the back, I don't know. But bear with me for a second and assume that that's a valid feature or something you really want to do. And I rotated over the course of 30 seconds. So great. So now I can show actually all the features of both animations and media playing well with controls. But I think there's one other problem that I noticed, which was that the text was kind of hard to read. So I'm going to fix that as well. And the same way that I set the background, I'm going to set the text foreground, and I'm going to set the text foreground to, well, you might as well just set it to that other robots.wmv file here. So now I think I really got a demo that kind of shows the power of the old playing with the new. Yeah, there we go. Now that's what I want to see in my apps on the web.
These waters millions of years before we were here.
What the weird thing is typing this way. So But the nice thing is the Dolphin now does a flip.
Yet they're completely at home in the sea.
So anyway, for what it's worth. The reason the video stopped is because this video ended, which is why you don't see the video drawing on here anymore. Anyway, just for fun, just kind of show you what we can do with the platform. So with that, I'm going to get on to actually something a little more practical. So I reset my text, and let's go ahead and get back to the talk. So that showed a little of the marrying of the old media platform and the new UI platform. But so what I want to do next is I really want to take you through the steps of building a basic application. And the basic application is this thing, and it'll be a combination of what I'll do in the beginning of the talk and what Mike will do in the ending of the talk. Now, I'm glad one of the things Mike and I talked about was we're actually talking to a real web service using the real network connection here. And one of the things that I didn't have when we originally did this app was we didn't have a please wait dialog or this little spinning thing right here because we're using it like at CorpNet and Microsoft, and we always had a great connection. And so you know what, maybe the connection there will be bad, which would really stink because if we had no connection, you wouldn't be able to see the app running. But I'm going to assume at one point in time I will have a connection, and this is going to work correctly. But what this is doing is it has a web server that's going out and grabbing some data, and it's showing a view going against real data. And unfortunately right now, I'm not getting that data. So, couldn't be. So, can you believe that? Anyway, it'll come back. I kid you not. So, try it in IE8. Did somebody really say that? Okay, you're dead to me, whoever that was. So, anyway, I'll walk you through the steps of this app. Hopefully, we're going to have network connectivity here. Otherwise, it will be, and I did test it beforehand. Otherwise, it will be not too long. Let me get rid of that. So the main things I want to do in the app is I want to go do a web service request to get the data. I want to convert the data to .NET objects, and I'll use link for XML to do that. And one of the reasons I want to do that is because it's easier to deal with .NET objects in terms of data binding than it is with plain XML. Then I'm going to create the master view on the left, and I'll create a details view on the right that actually plays the video, and then I'll add a search UI to it. And that's what I'll do in my part of the talk, and then Mike will come in on his part of the talk, and he will go ahead and add some additional UX features and use some local storage and some other things. So first thing, I want to get data. And so there's a couple different ways I can get data in Silverlight. I can do a network request to the same domain to get the data, just basically an HTTP GET or POST. I could use local data, and Mike will talk about that in the second part of the talk, or I could make a cross-domain request to get some data, which is what I'm going to do. But the last two are interesting, cross-domain request and local data. So that implies maybe doing something you're not used to doing in the browser. So I do want to talk about really what can Silverlight do? So a little sidebar on the Silverlight sandbox, if you will. What do we allow Silverlight to do? Effectively, we limit Silverlight to doing effectively what the browser allows you to do. So we don't allow Silverlight access to additional resources that a normal web page wouldn't have access to. And there's no way a developer can extend that via any sort of prompting mechanism. So you go to a website, you run a Silverlight app, you shouldn't be any more concerned about running a Silverlight app than running any normal web page, or less concerned. How about that, than running a normal web page? Now, there are a couple areas, like cross-domain, where there are things that you can do in Silverlight that there's analogous ways to do them in a normal web browser scenario, and we wanted to provide analogous ways to do these things, but it didn't necessarily map to do it the same way. For example, we didn't want to necessarily put the JSON tricks you do for doing cross-domain today into Silverlight, so we have an analogous way to do that. And so there are a couple key areas where we do things in a sort of similar but different way than the browser. One is, instead of cookies, we have a local storage mechanism, and Mike will talk about that. Another addition we have is the ability to do a save file open, and in the second part of the talk, Mike will talk about that as well. We also have sockets, and Aaron was up here beforehand. If anybody saw me doing the real-time edit to the slides, he wanted me to remind everybody or tell everybody that I won't be talking about sockets in depth in this talk, but he has a talk tomorrow, or in the sandbox he's doing something at 11:30 tomorrow where he's going to talk about sockets in more depth, since I'm not covering it here. But in beta 1 we do support sockets, but there are some restrictions on sockets, and we support cross-domain requests as well, HTTP requests. Now, similar to how it works in the web browser today, we have sort of something that requires the server to allow you to do cross-domain requests. And what I mean by similar to HTML today or the browser today, so effectively if you want to expose your data via JSON today in the browser, effectively the server, the person who owns the server, has to expose it as JSON. So they're sort of opting in. We have the same kind of model with Silverlight and cross-domain requests. If you want to allow your site, if you want Silverlight to be able to access a site cross-domain, that site has to have a policy file that says it's okay for Silverlight to access it cross-domain. And they can either have a Silverlight policy file, or we also support a subset of the Flash policy file, which means we work with a huge set of existing content that already has that policy file in place. So with that, let me give you an example of this. Come on, web, be up. Otherwise, get your book, read it. It's going to be a fun. Yes. Whew. Say it, please. So this is a real live web request. And it looks like it's just a little slow. I just hit F5 on it. And it's returning, every time I hit F5, it's returning different data. But this is a web request on catalog.video.msn.com. This returns plain old XML. So I couldn't add I couldn't basically add a proxy to it automatically because they don't support it. Otherwise, it would make my job a little easier. Instead, I'm going to do a plain old HTTP get to call effectively this exact link here, get some XML back, and then I'm going to turn it into .NET objects. Now, the reason I can make this cross-domain request to catalog.msn is because they've deployed a policy file, which is here. You can see the policy file is at catalog.video.msn.com. So they've deployed it, and it says it's okay for someone to access me or Silverlight to access me cross-domain. The first thing baked in the core of the Silverlight runtime we do when we see a web request is we say, is this a cross-domain request? If so, we do a request for the policy file. We do one for the Silverlight policy file if it exists. We look at it, and if it says okay, we go ahead and do the network request. Or if the Silverlight policy file doesn't exist, we fall back to the Flash policy file. And if that exists and it says it's okay to access cross-domain, then we go ahead and honor that, and we'll allow the request to proceed. So that's really what I'm going to be doing. And the next part of my talk is let's get back to building the application. I'm going to go ahead and make a cross-domain request to get that content. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the web client. But before I do that, what I do want to add here as a quick sidebar is since I see our network is acting up, I'm going to go ahead and add a bit of code. And I'm just adding markup. All I did is just crammed in a big set of markup, and I'll show you what it does. It displays one of these spinning things, and a designer actually built this. And by default, when I load and run this app, I haven't done anything else. Whoops. I know what it is. I had some code in the back that I got to take out since I deleted the corresponding text box. All I did is I just added some markup that, just all declarative, that spins. And what I'm going to do is when my web request is done, I'm going to make that thing go away. But this is just so that you know that if we're waiting for anything, we're waiting for that network request to come back. I'm in my page.xaml.cs file, and let me just show you the couple things I pre-primed this with. That URL I just called is right here. All I've done, just so you didn't have to watch me type it in, I've put this string in here that has that URL. This is the page constructor, so this is the main page that's displayed when I run the app. And in the page constructor, just to keep things clean, I call get videos with that URL that's the web service URL. And that puts me right here. So this is basically called by the constructor. So let's do the web request. And the way I do that is I do web client. This basically is our API that does effectively an HTTP GET. We have another one called HTTP web request. Thank you, Mike. Which is a little more powerful, allows you to get and post and look at headers. I just want a simple string return because I'm doing a plain old XML get. So this is a very simple API for doing that. So equals new web client, and you see the IntelliSense in Visual Studio makes it very easy. Now, the web requests we do in Silverlight, anything we do that is that takes a significant amount of time, like a network request, we do it what's called asynchronously. And what I just added is I added a completion handler. So effectively I said, I'm going to make a web request, and when that web request is done, call this routine. And now I'm going to go ahead and make the web request. So I'm going to say webc dot, and this is how you make the web request, and I'm going to pass it in that URL that I showed you before, this thing right here. So effectively what I've done is I said, create a new web request, which does an HTTP GET. Then I say, oh, by the way, when I call that thing, and I go do the GET, call this handler when it's all done, and then I say, okay, go do it. So this call will immediately return. So the UI is not blocked. You'll still see the thing spinning. It'll immediately return, and when that web request comes back in, this method will get called. And when this method gets called, it returns an argument, which is here. And if I look at that argument, it has e.result in it. And that's basically the result of the return payload from that HTTP GET. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, HTML page.window.alert. And this is a way to tunnel through to call the browser alert. And I'm going to say e.result. And what I just said there is, oh, by the way, when I'm all done, call this method and do a JavaScript alert effectively that shows the contents of that. The one thing I do want to drag in here, just so you don't have to see me type in 2 more lines of code, is I do want to type in or pull in a set of code that stops that animation. So effectively what this says is, as soon as you return, after you get that web request, go ahead and hide that animation. And so let's go ahead and look at it. So I go call the web service. First of all, I spin that up, call the web service, and there's the results of the web service. So step 1, get data. If I F5 it again, step 1, get data. It's new data. Live web service, done. Okay, so 1 step done, and what are we, 30 minutes into the talk. I got 5 to go, so bear with me. So let's go back, and let's see if we can take care of step 2. So I called the web service, got plain old XML returned. Now I have that XML as a string. I really want to turn it into a set of .NET objects. And the framework has a great set of ways to do that. And there's actually several things that I could do to turn it into .NET objects. I could use our XML serialization APIs. I could use an XML reader, which is like a SAX forward-only reader. In my case, I'm going to use link to XML. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I have to do some level of shaping of this data. So let me walk you through the data here real quick. That's the policy file. This is the data. What's returned in this plain old XML request is you see there's a set of a root video tag and then a set of video elements. And the video elements have the kind of things you'd expect in them, like a title, a description. But it's also got something like the actual video file. But if you notice, the video file is actually buried in here somewhere. There's the WMV video file. But it's sort of a sub-element under video files. And then it's another sub-element under that called video file. And another sub-element under that called URI. And I only want it if the format code is 102. Turns out link is great for doing exactly that kind of thing. It's really good for doing SQL queries on top of XML data. So that's why in this case it made sense for me to use link. So let's go back to the talk and let's go ahead, I think. Yep, so link for XML, and I think I'm, back to the demo. What I want to do here is for each of those video elements in that file I showed you, for each of the video elements, I want to create a corresponding business object for it, and I want to put all those into a list. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio here. So the last piece that I had pre-primed is I created a business object. And this business object is this video source business object. And it has effectively somewhat, it maps to the video elements that's returned in the XML. And all it does is have a title, description, video URL, image URL, those sorts of things. So now I got to get that XML return, iterate through that XML, and basically for each of those video elements, create one of these video source business objects, put them all in a big list, and populate them. And that's what I'm going to do with link to XML. And I'm going to do it right here. And the way I'm going to do that is, first of all, I want to create my list of business objects, and we have generics in the platform. The type I just showed you was video source, so here I say list of, I created a generic list of videos, and I do want to initialize that, so under videos equals new list of video source. And so all I've done at this point in time is my network request returns, I've turned off the spinning thing, and now I've created a new empty list of these video sources, and now I want to populate it. So rather than typing in my link query here, I'm going to save you that many lines of code and just drag it in, and then I'll explain what I did here. So the first thing that happens in this thing that I dragged over is this is a link X document, and what that does is it basically, this line right here creates a DOM, if you will, a document object model on top of the return results. If you remember, e.result had my XML. All I said here is effectively create a XML DOM, an XML DOM that is, something that I can read the data within there using the return results. Now what I can do with this document here is I can do link type queries on top of it. In this case, I'm going to do a for each, but I can also do the SQL type select queries on top of my data, which is really powerful. In this case, just to show you the code here is actually really simple. I grab my document object model here, and this lives in a namespace, and this is the special code that I dragged in below here. I predefined my namespace. It turns out my XML that's returned, these video elements live in a special XML namespace, which you can see it in red right here. So what I'm doing in this query is I'm just saying, find me each video element, child video element, that lives in this namespace, and for each one of those, do the following. Add a new video source, which was the business object, to my videos class I just created. And for each one of those, go ahead and set the title of that video source to an element in that video with, in this case, the title sub-element. So if I go back into there and look at my video, you'll see, here's my video element. It's got a title, and there's the title right there. So I just am pulling out the title, and I'm shoving it into the title of the business object. That's really all there is to it. It's really straightforward. The only thing I did in here that was the stuff I pulled in beforehand is I did do one of these more complex queries that I was telling you about, and that's called to get the video URL. So I have to dig down several layers deep to get that video URL, and you can see I do basically a SQL select statement right on top of that. The sample source code has already been published, by the way, I think on Mike Harsh's blog. Mike will talk about it, so I won't cover exactly this query in depth, but you'll be able to see it on Mike's blog and get the source code from there, and it'll run again on your beta 1 bits. But effectively, that's all I needed to do to take this XML and turn it into an array of business objects. But now that I've done that, I'm going to get a half a step ahead of myself here, because I have it, and I want to create this view for it. But before I create the view, I want to just make sure I've got my data correct. And the way I'm going to do that is I want to visualize it quickly. And I can think of a good way to do that. So I'm going to add a reference. So effectively what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, load, I want to use a different library. Not a library. I don't want to use something that was shipped with the core runtime. I want to use a library somebody else created. And in this case, I grab the system.windows.controls.data library. And that's a library that ships with our SDK. And what I do have to do is I have to tell the XAML here how to find controls that exist in that library. And I do that through a namespace mapping. And I'm basically going to say anything in the data namespace effectively, map it to system.windows.controls. I'll show you what I'm done here. I must have passed it. System.windows. Passed it again. System.windows.controls. There we go. That guy right there. So if you see what the line created, it said anything, assembly means library, anything that lives in that library, I'll reference it in my XAML using something called data. So the nice thing about this, the beautiful thing about this is now I can do data, and I get IntelliSense into that library, and you can see I have something really nice to visualize my data with. A data grid, we will ship with one of those in our SDK, which is a really nice feature. And I'm going to give it a name, results, and I'm going to say auto-generate columns equal to true, so I don't have to generate the columns, and I'm going to give it a height. Not a header visibility, a height of 600, and let's go ahead and make sure I didn't have, and one last thing I need to do. I need to set the data source of that. So that's the data grid, results is the data grid. The way you set a data source on a list control is using the item source and equals under videos. So I filled this video using this XML, and now I've gone ahead and data bound it to the grid. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this produces. My please wait spinning dialog, we're waiting, and there we go. And there you see by default we get a nice little grid view. And this is the default grid view. As you can see, it doesn't do the best job with image URLs because it doesn't know it's an image URL. I didn't tell it was. Now I could spend, if they would have given me and Mike 3 sessions, I could have spent another session just talking about the configurability of the data grid because it is a super powerful control, and actually the configurability of our controls in general. They wouldn't give us 3 sessions. So in the absence of that, I'm going to show you that if I had another session to go ahead and show you how to format the data grid. I just dragged in, all it is a bunch of declarative content that does exactly that. It formats the data grid to make it appropriate for the content I just displayed. And with that, you'll see something, you'll see nothing, and I'm going to rebuild the solution, and I'm not sure I gave it the same name. Here we go, run it again. This should work. And there we go, waiting for the web request, there we go. And there you can see, now I've got, just with that declarative view in the data grid, it's actually playing the video, and the video is buffering right now, which is why you don't see the video. But just with that little bit of markup, I'm able to add the data grid and quickly format it to create this kind of a view with it. So really nice, really powerful. So going back to my talk, so I have now my data as .NET objects, which is great. Now I want to build my main view on the left side, my master view. So that's what I want to do next. But in order to do that, I'm going to need to use some controls. So Scott, in his keynote, talked about some of the controls we have. This is the list of Beta 1 controls we'll have. We'll have additional controls post Beta 1. The list in the left, those are the controls that, what I'll say are intrinsic controls that will ship with the core runtime in Beta 1. So if you do the core Silverlight download, you get all the controls on the left-hand side. The ones on the right are currently SDK or additional library controls, so these would ship as part of your app. And that includes the data grid that I just showed you. But let me just show you a few of the controls actually really running. So this is just a test page, and it shows you the text box you've seen. I'll show you the watermark text box later on. We have, tooltip, button, a toggle button. Now, one thing about the toggle button is that's actually in toggled state. That's in non-toggled state. You may look like it doesn't look there's not a big difference between toggle and non-toggle. Karen Corby has got a talk tomorrow where she's going to talk about skinning controls in depth, and she's going to show you how you can completely easily change the behavior from a designer perspective, or the look, I should say, the skin of that control to provide if you wanted a greater difference between the two states. But the standard things you would expect: radio button, checkbox, grid splitter, a slider control, a calendar control, date time picker, scroll viewer, all part of the Beta 1 build. And this is not my puppy, but just to give you an idea, scroll viewer kind of thing. So a lot of controls that ship in the platform, and I'll be using a set of those to build out the rest of the UI. In addition, I talked about layout, but one of the core things that I'm going to need to take advantage of to lay out my master view is I'm going to need to use layout. Now, layout is really composed of what I'll say are containers that know how to lay out children, and then some things that you can do to the children or the underlying controls to support layout. The containers that we'll ship with in Beta 1 are a grid control, which I'll talk a little bit about in my next part of my demo. A stack panel you've seen, a border, something that allows you to put a border around a control. Canvas is what we had in Beta 1, in version 1, and a canvas is what allows you to absolutely position things. So it's not really a layout control per se. We also support margin and padding on our controls, which I showed you in the beginning. And margin, specifies how far controls sit relative to other controls. Layout is super important for being able to do auto layout when you have things like dynamic text and you need to change the size of things dynamically at runtime. It makes it super easy to deal with that. We also have layout extensibility. You may be looking up here and going, my favorite layout container, whether it's a wrap panel or whether it's some string or whatever struts and strings model, springs model, something like that, or a dock panel is not here. That's okay. We have an extensible model that allows you to build your own. We fully expect that the Silverlight team will build a set of those, but we also expect with the extensibility that third parties will build their own favorite set of layout containers as well. Mike will be showing in his talk, he will be giving an example of how to do custom layout and build a custom layout container. The last piece that I do want to talk about before I get on to the remainder of my talk or the remainder of my demos is data binding. And data binding is what's going to make it really easy for me to take those .NET objects and to visualize them. And there are two types of layout, two types of data binding supported in Silverlight. There's standard property binding, and property binding is taking a property on a UI element, like a text box's text property, and data binding it to something like a business object, like my video source's title property, using data binding. The data source or the business object's value gets automatically reflected in the UI, and you can do vice versa with two-way data binding. The way you data bind for property binding is you use a data context, and I'm going to give an example of that in the next slide. List binding is what I did with the grid. That's where you want to take a control, a list-based control, such as either a list or a data grid, or an items control, which is what I'll show in the next part of my demo. When you take one of those and bind them to a list-based data source, you're creating UI for each of the items in the list. And one of the powerful features that we have to support list-based binding is the ability to do a template kind of model, or if you're familiar with ASP.NET's repeater model, we support that. And the way that works, and that's kind of be the workhorse for the next part of my demo, is that effectively you can think of it as you have a view and you have your data. So in this case, the view being like the data template. You have data, which is an array of .NET objects, and you have a workhorse like an items control or a list control that knows how to marry those two together. And what the items control does in this case is you give it a data template, and then you give it an item source, which is an array of items, and it says for each of the items in my item source, create one of those data templates. And for each one of those data templates that I instance, set its data context to the item in the list. So for example, it'll take, I have two items here in my list. If you see, that's what these two items are here. I have two items. The first one has HTML as the file name. Effectively, what the items control will do is it'll create a data template, set the first data template's data context to be this business object, and then create another one of these and set the next one's data context to be this. Now let's take one step further. You'll notice these both have this funky little syntax, binding equals file image URL. What this says is this uses simple property binding. And it basically says, for this property right here, for the source property of this image, go into its data context, or its parent's data context, or its parent's data context, because data context flows that way. Go find if you've got something that's non-null, so see if you've got some business object or some object there. If so, grab its file image URL property and shove it right here. The same thing for the text property, does the exact same thing. So the beauty of this model, it's really that simple, is that all I need is a template, a list of objects, the binding syntax, and an items control, and I can quickly whip out UI like this. Declaratively, it's really simple and powerful. So I'll show you a real example of how that works. So I'm going to now create the main view using exactly that feature set, and jumping back over to Visual Studio. And the first thing I want to do is I want to, let's get rid of my data grid. Since I'm going to create a master detail view, I want to add I want to make basically a multi-column grid. I want two columns, one column for my master and one column for the details. One thing I didn't explain at the very beginning is that by default the templates in Visual Studio, the default Silverlight project creates its root container as a grid, and it doesn't add any cells, it doesn't add any rows or columns in a grid. It has just effectively by default one row and one column, and any content you put in it is stretched to fill up the whole grid content. So all along, everything I've been showing you has actually been done in a single cell in a grid. What I want to do is I want to add a couple columns to that, and the way I'm going to do that is with markup, XAML, the way that you typically do things in Silverlight. So I'm adding a couple column definitions, and if you noticed immediately my spinner moved off to the left, and the reason why is because I added a couple column definitions to the grid, and I specified two columns, which is what this two column definitions underneath the grid.column definitions element, and I said the second one is 480 pixels wide, and just to make it easier for you to visualize what's going on, I'm going to say show grid lines true. And if you look up top, sorry, it's kind of, you see that little fuzzy line there? That's where the grid line is. So now I have two columns. The first column I said take up all the space. The second column take up 480. But I can do things like proportional, so I can say 2, 3 star, and 7 star, for example. It says the first one take up 30%, the second one take up 70%, but in my case, this is the layout I want. I want the second one to take up 480 and the first one to take all the rest of the space. I've added one row, And the one row says take up all the space. So I only have one row here. Now, how do I put things in one column or the other? I use the grid.column property, and I could say we start at 0. So 1 means 2, 2 means 3. I almost got that wrong. I see everybody's still with me. So 0 means -1. I'm confused. So by default, the grid.column is 0. So by default, it lives in the first column. But I can also do things like, say, let's see, grid.callspan equals 2. And in this case, 2 means 2, not 1. So I know it's confusing. If you're developers out there, you'll get it after a while. So this way, I've basically done a column span. So the grid is really like an HTML table, and the same tricks you used to play with you still do with an HTML table, you can do with the grid in Silverlight. I don't need the grid column because I'm fine with that being in the first column. But effectively, now I've added 2 columns. So now I'm going to add some content, and the content I want to add is the items control. And the items control is the thing that I talked about in the previous slide that says I can take a template and a list and I can marry them together to create UI. So I'm going to create an items control, and I want to set its vertical alignment equal to top, which says I want it to be at the top of this page, and I want to give it a name. And I'm going to give it the same name I gave my data grid. And that's just so I don't have to rewrite that other line of code in here, which by the time I show you that I don't have to rewrite this line of code, I could have rewrote this line of code, but I just gave it the same name so I don't have to rebind it, which means this will just work. Now, I have to give it a template. Well, thank you. Thanks. You are still with me. If you're the guy who said that about IE8, I'm back to liking you. You're not dead to me anymore. I'm going to give you a hug right after this talk. So if you could write the rest of this for me, though, I'd appreciate it. Item control dot, let's see, item template. I got it. We're back on track. And then I want to give this a data template. And then I'll explain what I just did here. And I do want to, I change the name of that thing, and sometimes I change the type of it. Sometimes Visual Studio will try to be really smart, so I rebuild the solution just so I can tell it that I'm smarter. So items, I just need to give this a data template. And I'm already binding it to a list of stuff. And if I give it a data template, in this case, let's keep it really simple at first. A text block, and I want to set the text equal to binding. And let's see, title, short title. So what that is my business object. Has something in it called short title right here. And I just bound short title. So effectively what I'm saying now is that when I do the binding, going back to my code behind, when I bind my videos list to this control, for each of the items in that list, I want you to create a text block and set the text block's text property to the short description you get from that business object. So if I didn't mess anything up, and I know where to go if I did, wait, there we go. And so this is live data, so I hit F5. And so it's really that simple. I had that one line of code, but that's all I really had, the one line of code to do the data binding. Otherwise, it's just creating a template and for the items control and giving a list of business objects. So super powerful. So the key thing here with XAML is that now all I really have to do is I have to have a designer go off and say, you know what, I want that to look a little nicer, and tell them what to bind to, and they can do the magic to effectively do what I just did, only for all the rest of the properties. And here's the short title, here's the short description that are all in that business object. So they've went ahead and created a view. Now, I said it's a designer, but I think anybody who's actually a designer here is going to take one look at this and go, Joe did that. And you're right, I did. But yeah, that's me. So that's all I did. I just changed that markup from the text block to that, and now I get this view in here. So I'm like halfway there now, or more than halfway with, let's see, 25 minutes to go, which is good. So now what I've done is just with that template binding, I created this view here on the right using taking the image URL and binding it to an image, taking, this is just a text block or either that or hyperlink. I bound the title to that and took the description and bound it to a text block and bound these things to a text block. So really simple. Now, I do want to get rid of this. That's from my show grid lines equals true. So let's get rid of that before we go on to the to the details view. False. Okay, let's jump back to the talk. So, building the master view, done, check. What's left? Creating a details view. So what I want to do now is I click on the item on the left. I want to have a view on the right-hand side that plays the video. And that's going to be, the way I'm going to do that is I could just do the same thing I've been doing before, which is take some XAML and put it in the main page. But I do want to show how you can create reusable controls within Silverlight, and we call these user controls. And effectively, you can think of it somewhat as like another page, and then you can just reuse that. So I'm going to do this as a user control, and then I'm going to jump right into adding search and a couple little fluffy animations to it to finish up. So I think with that, let's go ahead. Let's finish the demo. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create basically a reusable control here. So I'm going to say add new item. And this reusable control is something that I could then, if I wanted to, I could give it to somebody else to use. And I'm going to call this details view. I could package this up as another library, but just think of it as another page. And in here, let's just start out with something really simple, a text block with text equal hello mix crowd. I think maybe I misspoiled it, but you get the idea. So what have I done? I just created this other reusable component. I can stick more than a text block in there. I could stick other controls if I wanted to as part of this. But now this thing can be packaged up and now reused as a separate library, although I included it in this project. So in this case, it's actually just part of the library that I've been working on here. And now I want to reuse that thing. So the way I reuse it is, since I did create a new name, if you will, I need to tell the XAML markup for this project where to find that details view thing that I just created. And the way I do that is the same trick I did before, which is I add an XML namespace, and I'm going to call this my. And again, Visual Studio has great IntelliSense. And this says, by the way, anything I create, my own controls that I create in my own project, I'm going to reference them using my. So I'm going to come down here and go ahead and add that thing. But before I do, I'm thinking ahead. I know I'm going to have a search area in here, so I'm going to leave some space for that. And I do want to set the horizontal alignment on this thing to left, because I know it'll make the search look a little nicer. And I'm going to set a margin equal to 4 as well. And then let's go ahead and add that details view. So it was my : details view. Wow, that sounds terrible. Hope nobody caught that. Geez, I gotta think of it. I never caught that until now. So anyway, moving along. That's something you would do, Mike. You set me up, didn't you? I get it now. Okay. That was not planned. Anyway, okay, moving on. I don't know how I'm gonna get out of that one. So I just named it details. Now, one thing you'll notice here, I'll rebuild and reload the designer. And you'll see this thing is off on the left, and the reason why is because I haven't set grid.column. And remember, everybody's keeping track. It's 1. Thank you. And there it goes. It flips over to the right-hand side. So I'll go ahead and run this. And so all I've done is I've just taken that reusable thing that I made, and now it's going to appear on the right-hand side, and there comes my list in there. Excellent. So now let's take the next step. I've got this reusable thing. How do I make it such that I can turn it into a details view? And I'm just going to do the same trick that I showed you before. I'm going to take that text and let's say binding and short text. That's it. So now if you remember, where does the short text need to come from? It needs to come from something on this thing's data context. So I need to set that. And the way I'm going to set that is when I click on the stack panel. So I'm going to try to run it. It may not run because I haven't finished my work here, but just to kind of show you, let's see if it does. Yeah. These things on the left, each one of these individual things is in a stack panel. So I'm going to add an event handler to this stack panel here that says when I click on this, I want to set the data context of this guy to this guy's data context. So let's do that now, and it's really effectively one line of code because I have to go to the stack panel. That's part of my data template, and I want to do it on mouse left button down, and Visual Studio automatically adds the handler for me. Really nice, really easy. Navigate to the event handler, and now let's just write my one line of code that marries up the two data contexts. And let's see, where are we now? Way down here. It's really one line of code, but just to keep myself from making mistakes. Details is the thing that I named, if you recall. That's what I named my user control. Wherever it is, here it is. I called him details, and I get Visual Studio gives me great IntelliSense on it, and I say details. I could have just typed data context, and I just gave it the data context of the thing I just clicked on. So it's pretty much that simple. So let's go ahead and run this. And see, I'm not writing a lot of code here. Okay, we'll try it again. I don't know what I did. Thank you. Is that the same guy again? Didn't it work before? What? Let's see, details view. Short. There it is. Go figure. Glad someone's paying attention here. Okay. Let's run it again. And that's why I don't type things in. There we go. And so you can see now I got this nice details view, really simple, really easy. And again, it's just not a lot of code. It's just once you get used to this model, it's so easy and so powerful to put these things together. So now all I have to do really to finish this app is once again, have a designer say, you know what, I need a little UI for playing back a video. And that's what they gave me. So let's get rid of the stuff I had in there before. And that's what I'm going to drag over now is just really simply, it's, okay, dragging over content. There we go. There we go. And this creates this view for me. And what the view has is, it's the text block that's bound to the correct short title. And then it has a media element and a border. What the border does is, I'll show you what that does real quick. A border is what allows me to really easily put these sort of rounded corners on controls that are otherwise square, like a media element. So I put a media element in there, which plays video. I bound it to the video URL. I put this border around it so like I could do things like 100 to create a really rounded corner. So it's sort of what designers use to create nice views. So that's all I did is I dragged in a media element and a few text blocks that round out the view. And now I can click on something, and you'll see I'll get my details. There we go. And it is really real network data. Now, what I haven't done here is you see that it takes a little bit of time for that video to come up. Reason I'm getting a real video, and it is buffering. I'm not creating an experience. I could create a please wait experience or that same little loading icon. I could create around my media experience using the media APIs. Ed Maya has got a talk, I believe it's tomorrow, where he's talking about the media element APIs, where he goes into detail of how to do that. So if you do want to see how you create even a better experience around the media element part of this, I encourage you to go to Ed's talk tomorrow. But so with that, the only thing I have really left to do in this app is I would like to, on startup, rather than not playing any video, to be really obnoxious, let's go ahead and just play the first video in the list at startup. So I'm doing the same binding I did below with the details data context. Now I'm just saying, oh, by the way, I'll go ahead and just set that details data context on startup. This is the end of my network. Actually, this is the end of my network request here. So on startup, I call get videos, which when it's done doing the network request, it calls this routine here. And I just say, when you're all done and you've filled your business object, go ahead and just data bind to the first element in the list. So now, by default, the first item here starts playing. And there you go, TKO32 way in. You get some, you get some interesting stuff on this random web service. There we go. Birds of Paradise, that's a little bit better. Sex change, go figure. My boss is here. My badge is right here. Kevin, if you're out there somewhere, I'm sorry. What can I say? So, where was I? Jeez. So, hopefully I'll get good content next. So the last thing I want to add, without jumping back into the slide deck, is I want to add search real quick. And search is just about as simple as everything else I've done. So, it's not going to take a lot of time because, once again, I have somebody create a little XAML for me, and I'll show you what this XAML does. I just dragged it in. It's a watermark text block, and I'm gonna zoom it up here. And I just added this. Right here at the top of that details view I added, it's a button. And Mike's going to show in the second part of our talk, he's going to show how to make this look a little less fugly, is the term he used. That's what he thinks of my design skills. But he will. He'll do a good job of that. So that's what I just dragged in, and I dragged in this watermark text box. And what that is well, I'll show it when I run the app. The only thing I want to do is I want to add an event handler to the text, the watermarked text box, so that when I key down, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit a search term and then hit enter. And when I key down, I'm going to add an event handler that says go off and do the search. So you would think the search might take a lot of code. It turns out it doesn't. And the reason why it doesn't is because it turns out the web service that I'm using to get the random data also has an analogous web service that does a search. And to call this web service, all I have to do, it returns the exact same content XML, the same plain old XML that the other one does. So if I run this, I will say run, and then I just give it a search term here like sports. Run it, and the Q equals sports. That determines the content I get. So if I do dogs, I'll get data. But you see the data is returned in the exact same format, which is great for this demo because all I have to do is go ahead and add my key down handler. So when I hit enter in there, I just check to see if the key is the inner key. If the key is the inner key, call get videos with this URL above, which is the URL I just showed you, the search URL, scrolling down, this search URL, and I just add the text in the search field to the end of that, which does the query for me. So very simple. Get videos, by the way, is that routine we added at the very beginning. The same thing I use to call the random video search. This thing right here, I'm just recalling it rather than using the random video search. I'm now using the search URL. That's it. That's all I had to do to implement search here. So now we'll go ahead and wait for the data to come up. This is the watermark text block. You see if I tab out of it, it says find videos, tab in it does that automatically. So I can type in funny, for example, and find funny videos. There we go. So we can watch a dramatic lemur, for example. This is, I'm on a real network connection talking to a real server somewhere that's really serving up this real video, which is real choppy and really slow. But this is supposed to be dramatic. So that's awesome. I'm glad you could come today. So to hear that chopped up video. Okay, excellent. So it's better than the alternatives. One last thing, and I am going to turn it over to, it looks like I have a little bit of time for questions. So one last thing I do want to show is that something that I talked about at the beginning, which is that as part of this platform, the really cool and great thing about it is it's not just you get media, it's not just that you get controls, you kind of get a stack that supports media, animations, controls. It all works together. So normally you think, what I really want to do is I want to provide a little pop-out UX experience where if I mouse over, I see it sort of pop out the page a little bit. So I'm going to add a couple animations here that do that. And I'm just adding these to the stack panel. And I added 2 animations. And all I really did, it's really super simple, is I added we have a scale transform. This existed in Silverlight 1.0. And it just says, it's a way that you can grow something. And by default, things scale factor, if you will, starts at 1, not 0. So I start at 1, and I can scale things, some multiple of that. And so I added a couple animations here that animate that transform on, really it's on, I'll show you the sample again. It animates the stack panels here. So these little things off on the left, I'm adding it to the stack panel that contains each one of these. So each one of these is going to have their own animation as part of it, which is what I'm adding now. So I'm adding it to that template. And by default, the scale transform is 1. So this is, hey, make those grow by nothing. Keep them the same size. I added a couple animations that say, oh, there's a grow animation. And I didn't make this one start at startup. I didn't do anything with it. In fact, it just lives in the tree dormant at this point in time. But I say grow both in the X and Y direction, 10%. 1.1 is 1.1 times your size. And then I have another animation that says, oh, shrink yourself back down to a value of 1. So I added a couple animations, and now all I need to do is trigger those. And by the way, there is a much better way declaratively to do what I'm going to do now using code. And if I can plug Karen Corby's session again, she will talk about the incredible, powerful states model we have for basically skinning controls that makes doing this even easier using the expression tools. But for now, I'm going to go old school and do mouse enter and add an event handler for that, and mouse leave and add an event handler for that, and just go into the event handler. All I want to do here is trigger those animations when I enter, and it really is one line of code. But once again, I'm not going to break precedent and try to type it in myself and then have to have somebody in the first row here tell me what I did wrong. I'm going to copy and paste it, and the other one was called shrink. Thank you. And so all I've done here is I've said when I mouse enter, call the grow animation, which was the one that grew it by 10%, and when I leave, call the shrink animation. And so again, I wrote all of 30 lines of code for this whole demo, and the majority of that was the link shaping stuff. Look at that, the last one, and just want to make sure that we rebuild everything here. And now it'll fire up correctly. If I hit Control F5, there we go. And here's the go figure. Anybody? We'll try it one. It's I don't know what I did. As in, I do know what I did, but let me just make sure I didn't do something strange in my XAML. Stack panel, blah blah blah. Everything looks good. Everything looks good here. Oh, that's not good. We'll get it. This really was the very last part of the last demo. Can you believe that? Okay, any day. So, have you seen the lemur with the big eyes? Hey, look at that. So, the demo gods are being kind to me. So what did I just, I added, look, there's Jay Moore. Get the idea? So, really quick and easy to add that simple effect. I mean, it makes it look like, I know something about UX, which I don't. So there, you get that nice little cool effect. So, with that, Mike, one final thing I want to do, which is I'm not going to play another random video, but I want to go back to the talk and go back up to, let's see, the one slide that had the link to my app on it, and let's go ahead and see if I can run the original app, because I want to do a quick segue into Mike's talk, and there we go, now it's running. And so see this little effect that happens here? And see the button that's, slightly less fugly. There, don't know where it is, Mike. There we go. This effect, the little bouncing in, Mike's going to show you how to do it. He's going to show you how to make the button a little nicer. He's going to actually add history linking to this, so you can go forward and backwards, that sort of thing. That's what's happening in the second part of the talk. And I'm going to take quick Q&A here, but before I do want to go down to, how far down is it? Go to, I do want to plug the other sessions, related sessions right here. So unfortunately, some of these sessions, like Ben Wagner's encoding session, is happening now. So you just missed that, but hopefully there'll be a repeat for it. But these are all related sessions where you can get additional detail that I couldn't cover in this talk, or Mike can't cover. But please stick around for the second part of the talk. Mike's actually got all the cool UI, UX stuff in there. With that, I do have, I'll stay here till the next talk starts, but I'll take questions now. So thank you, everybody. Oh, and I think you can get your books now. Can you get your books? Books? Did you get your books? What? You got your books already? They ran out? Mike Harsh will... Apparently not. So there are posters in the back that are being handed out now for people who didn't get a book. Sorry about that. Send email to Bill G. Scott Goo at... Anyway. No, I'm just joking. Those are not real email addresses, really. Anyways, enough monologuing. Questions? Let's go ahead.
I was seeing you having a problem typing the binding because you didn't remember the name, and that made me think about IntelliSense for binding. So any chance we will get that in the final version?
Yeah, so the question is, we have IntelliSense for binding. I don't know if someone from the Visual Studio Cider team is here, but I believe they are. They can yell at me if I'm saying something incorrect, but I believe they're working on providing that sort of experience in both for both WPF and Silverlight. The target is still about a year out. Okay. And again, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the last word that I heard on it. But yes, they are going to provide.
Be for VS10 or?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. The other thing is that in Expression Blend, which I didn't use, which Michael showed, they do have a designer already for doing data binding. So you don't have to type in the markup. They actually have a designer that allows you to do object binding like this, so you actually don't make a mistake up front because it builds it for you.
For Silverlight too?
Yeah, for Silverlight.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's really, really cool.
Good job.
I wish I could have shown it, but I think Michael showed a little bit of it, but it's a really cool feature.
Excellent, thank you.
Yep. Go ahead.
Is the data grid available today?
The data grid, the question is the data grid available? Absolutely. It ships in the SDK today. Everything you saw today ships today, and it's available to you. Go ahead.
Is there a kind of a roadmap that lets me know what in WPF is also in Silverlight? Because it looked like the XAML you were writing looked a lot like the stuff I'm writing for WPF. I'm sorry. Is there kind of a roadmap that tells me what in Silverlight and the Silverlight XAML is going to be different from WPF XAML? Yeah, so the question is that he knows that the markup was a lot like WPF markup, and that's true. We're a subset, effectively, of the WPF markup, and he's wondering if there's going to be some document that details the differences between the WPF and Silverlight, and yes, we are. We've actually got some stuff internally that articulate the differences. We just need to get it customer ready and out to customers, but yes, there will be something that does that. Next question. Will there be anything in Silverlight like bitmap effects in WPF, such as drop shadow, glows, or blurs, or anything like that? That's a great question. Will there be the equivalent of bitmap effects, or the equivalent in Silverlight, or pixel type effects? I can't commit to anything along those lines, but maybe someday something might be in the works. Okay. But there's no press here that could ever quote me on anything like that. Thanks. So yes, we are thinking about exactly that feature, and we are working on providing that feature. So,
do you have to worry about using the UI thread?
So the question is, do you have to worry about using the UI thread? Everything that we do that is a busy operation, like networking requests, we all do. We don't provide a way to do a UI thread version of that. You have to. I say we don't today. We have had requests to do that. We may do it in the future. But everything we do, we try to always do using a callback model, so you can't block the UI thread. So the goal is that we try to make it so that it's really, I won't say impossible, because you could certainly write a while loop that does a while one that blocks the UI thread. But we try to make it so that you as a developer have to work really hard to do that.
Sure. Do you have to invoke onto the UI thread then?
No, the callbacks that I showed. So the question is, do you have to invoke actually? The callbacks that we use for like our networking stack all automatically call back onto the UI thread.
Sure. Thank you.
To elaborate on the SDK controls, what's the difference between what's included in the native, the core, versus the SDK? Like, what is the difference between the two? Well, so the question is, what's the difference between something that's included in the core runtime versus something that's included in the SDK? And effectively, we wanted to try to keep the size of the core runtime as small as possible. So we tried to draw a line, and it is a gray line between what we felt were the set of controls that were used. Take some number 80% by 80% of the customers, and those are the kind of ones we wanted to put in the core. The other ones we put in the SDK. If we get it wrong, it's easy for us to take things in the SDK and just push them to the core. In the future, we also want to look at things where you can cache our SDK library so that it's really you download it once per app, or download it once, not per app, but just download it once. And if multiple apps use the same SDK library, it's persisted. But as of today, you package them as part of the app. But the key thing is that it's kind of a little bit of a fuzzy line. But we tried to take the most common ones and put them in the core, and the other ones we kept in the SDK. So anything in the SDK needs to be reloaded every time an app loads. It's reloaded with the app. So it's loaded once for your app, and then it's only loaded once per your app, or downloaded once per your app. Now, I didn't talk about all the experience we have around
demand or delay loading libraries. You can fully control all of that with our app model. Super powerful, but there are ways that even if you want to provide an experience around loading, let's say you had a bunch of your own SDK type libraries, you can provide an experience where you load those in the background, that sort of a thing.
Cool, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, do you support writing bitmaps or well, and I have another question, but.
So the first question is, do we support writing bitmaps?
Yeah.
We support, so Mike just says negative ghostwriter is the way that he explains it. I try to put a more optimistic spin on it. We don't have a bitmap API. What we do have is we have the ability to set an image source, if you will, via a stream. And the stream happens to be a compressed stream, meaning it has to be JPEG or PNG encoded. So if you wrote your own PNG or JPEG decoder, yes, you could do that. However, being able to do direct bitmap manipulation directly is not something that's supported by our platform. There are workarounds today. That is something we want to support. We actually are actively looking at it. One of Mike's guys, in fact, is right now sitting back in Redmond looking at bitmap API, or specifically bitmap APIs.
But we couldn't write them either, or we couldn't like generate one on demand either.
We say generate one on...
Like apply an effect to it and let them save it onto their machine.
You'd have to do it using, you'd have to re-encode it as effectively as a PNG. So you could do whatever you want. You create your own memory stream, if you will, put your own bits in there, encode it yourself to a PNG, write it to an image to create your effect. So really, really painful. Not ideal. We know it's painful, and it's something we want to improve on in the next version of Silverlight.
Okay, and then quickly, because there's no rich text box, I've read that you recommend using like an HTML editor or something like that.
Yeah, that's one solution. The question is, there's no rich text box today. So what are your options?
Well, can you layer these things with Silverlight objects? Like, so you have Silverlight object, HTML object, and then Silverlight object on top of that.
So the question is, can you layer things on top of HTML on top of
right.
Silverlight? There are some issues. Is that a complete negative, Mike? With you have to, yeah. The issue is with. You can do it. You have to make your Silverlight control windowless, and then when you make it windowless, if you're familiar with how the browser works with object tags, there can be some performance issues with making things windowless. It just ends up being, there are certain things that don't work, like accessibility doesn't work, and IMEs don't work when you're windowless. It's a little poor performance, but you can't play those tricks. You have to sort of manage the stack yourself in order to do it,
All right.
But you can do that.
All right, cool, thanks.
Go ahead.
In the keynote this morning, we saw some of the deep zoom functionality. I'm just wondering if that means that HD photo is supported now as an image format.
So the question, wow, that's a great question. So the question is that you saw some of the deep zoom technology, which Mike will be demoing in his talk and showing you how you actually build those. And the question is, do we have HD photo support? Because you understand that the underlying technology of deep zoom was at one time HD photo, but they're actually more image format agnostic. So today, the tiles that they generate are actually JPEGs. And so we don't do it using HD photo format. We do it using JPEG. It has been a request where we have heard requests to support HD photo. It's something that we will look at in the future, adding to the platform, but as of today, we don't have that.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, yeah. Is the notify property changed interface supported as well?
So the question is, do we support iNotify property change? Being a former data binding person, I could have spent at least a whole talk on doing data binding, and I'm happy to say that we do have that feature in there. I just didn't demo it, but we have it. It works.
Will Silverlight ever be open sourced?
Will Silverlight ever be open sourced? Wow. Yes, so we have the controls are released on the Microsoft basically open source license. Will all of Silverlight be open sourced at some point in time?
To allow third-party developers to contribute to it?
I do not have an answer for you at this point in time. It's not out of the question. It's not something where we have imminent plans to do. So you're asking about all of Silverlight, right? Everything.
Just as will third-party developers be able to contribute to Silverlight and have it commit to the main trunk?
Well, so there are our controls today to the main trunk. So I know I'm splitting hairs here, but we have our controls today are released, and third-party developers, we don't have a way for them to contribute in that they can't make changes and then resubmit them back to Microsoft. That is something that we have another team that develops Silverlight controls, the toolkit team that did the ASP.NET controls where they had that model, they'll have a similar model where they do additional Silverlight controls where they do have exactly that open source model. Will we end up taking that and pushing it all the way down to all the controls in Silverlight? It's a possibility. It's not out of the question. Just today, our focus has been getting Silverlight 2 out the door, and I don't have a great answer for you on that, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibilities. It's just not planned today. Go ahead.
I just make sure I understood you correctly. So in Silverlight 2.0, you cannot set as a source for image memory stream?
You can't set a stream. It's just a compressed stream. It's not raw bits. So it means it has to be pre-encoded as a PNG or JPEG. But you can't set it as an image stream. You don't have to
save it to the server just as a URL. Okay.
No, exactly. You don't have to just send a URL. You can actually, you can download the image, get the bits yourself, and then send them to the stream, or you could create the bits on the fly. The only issue is you just have to encode them before you give them to as a stream to our image.
Thank you.
Am I eating into your time? Okay. All right. Well, I encourage everybody to stick around because Mike does have the sexier part of the talk. So thanks, everybody.